I've done it again. Another 70s inspired integrated bracelet, sort of, sports watch. If I were a superhero or villain, they would surely be my one critical weakness. There are a couple of questions we're going to try and answer in this video, and they are: who are Nivada Grenchen? Is this a watch worth me keeping to add to my collection? And where does this rank against other budget sports watch options? I've held off on making this review for a long time to try and take the watch somewhere that will really show off its style, and I can only hope that the location and visuals do it justice, even if the weather hasn't. With all that said, let's get into the video. Formed in the small Swiss town of Grenchen, the company was founded in 1926, though its roots date back further than that to a family-run watchmaking workshop that was in operation from 1879. In 1939, the brand struck a deal with the Croton Watch Company in New York to have their models distributed and sold in the US. Some vintage models therefore feature both brand names and some just Croton, so looking through their back catalogue can require more searching than you might think. If you haven't heard of Nivada Grenchen before, you might still recognise perhaps their most famous model, the Chronomaster, which has a design language not unlike the modern Omega Seamaster Heritage range. Given the rising popularity of chronographs at the time, the Chronomaster became a brand staple following its release in 1963 and continued to have healthy sales figures into the 1970s. However, like many other watch brands, the quartz crisis signalled the death knell for Nivada, and by 1980 they were no longer able to keep themselves afloat. This was a few years after trying to stay on trend with models like the original F77 had not ultimately been enough to keep the coffers flowing. The brand was sold off to a South Korean watch company, who then sold it on to a Mexican watch company. In 2018, the watch brand was bought back into Swiss ownership with the goal of upgrading and re-releasing models from their back catalogue that were now in demand again thanks to the resurgent popularity of 70s inspired sports watches. That tale of storied history, bankruptcy and reinvention is all too common among smaller watch brands. The F77 is a very faithful recreation though, keeping the strengths but also some of the weaknesses of the original. That leads us neatly onto our second question of the video. Usually this would have been the main talking point of the video, but I just had so much to say on this model it's been relegated to a subsection, but nonetheless an important talking point. To begin with, let's go over the basics of the watch. The F77 is available in either stainless steel or the slightly pricier but lighter titanium. The range utilises the Soprod P24 movement, and depending on the dial you choose, some variants are available with an added date complication. The price stays the same with or without. When it comes to the dial options, you've got black, blue, meteorite, adventurine and lapis options, alongside the model you're seeing here, which is the only one in the range to feature a colour gradient, the brown smoke. One unexpected side effect that this watch has had is that I've never had a watch that gets this much attention in public before. I'm not for a moment suggesting that putting this on turns you into celebrity and people will be rushing to speak to you in the street, but I've had more people speak to me to get information on this watch while out and about than any other in my collection, and by a big margin. There are two factors at play here. The first is that as a 70s inspired sports watch, this model takes inspiration from and looks like a lot of far more expensive and well-known watches like the Royal Oak. It is worth saying that it's actually a reissue of the original F77 model, though it would be disingenuous to suggest that the original hasn't taken some serious Genta inspiration. The second thing that people are curious about is the dial. It's unusual, and by far and away my favourite part of the watch. If you've seen any of my lists or looked at any of the reviews I've done, it's quite clear that I am a sucker for a textured dial. This one is modelled after a carbon weave, but the real standout is the gradient dial that Nivada Grenchen have called brown smoke. The combination of weave pattern and gradient colour creates a real chameleon of a dial. I've tried my best to capture it on film for you to see, but the truth is that the camera just doesn't do it justice. More so than any other watch I own, this piece looks so different in tone from different angles. Catch the light at just the right angle and it practically glows. Long-term viewers of the channel will know that my de facto motto is dimensions are king. The F77 is period correct in terms of its sizing and comes in at 37mm in diameter, which is absolutely perfect for me, but I understand will be too small for some. The thing about the dimensions of the F77 is that they are deceptive. The stated lug-to-lug is 45mm, but as the first set of connecting links have very limited flexibility, in essence the effective lug-to-lug is actually closer to 50mm. I still think it fits well on my wrist, but it certainly wears a lot bigger than a 37mm diameter watch might initially indicate. That puts the watch into a difficult position, as really it is going to fit best on medium-sized wrists for people who prefer small dials. People with smaller wrists, who would normally be fine with a 37mm watch, will find that this watch has a good deal of overhang at the edges. Given my affection for this watch, I'm glad to be in the happy middle ground where the watch fits perfectly, but doesn't look comically small on wrist either. In terms of actually physically fitting, the bracelet has full size and micro links to it, as well as 7 points of adjustment on the comfortable clasp, so most people will be well catered for. The model you're seeing here is obviously on that bespoke bracelet, but some models in the F77 range are also available on a canvas strap with Velcro fastenings. I would seriously advise against that option. While the fitted strap is custom made just for the watch, it really just doesn't look the part. Most brands use rubber for their fitted strap options, so I'm not really sure why they've tried to buck the trend with canvas. It stands out from the crowd, but perhaps not in the right way. The reason I brought it up though is that it does make the watch more viable for smaller wrists, as the effective lug-to-lug is going to be as stated rather than elongated. The other key watch dimension worth bringing up here is the thickness of the model. It's listed as 12.6mm thick, but I have to say that when I measure it, it comes in at 11.5mm and 9.5mm if you ignore the height of the domed crystal. Now to the main thrust of this middle portion of the video. Is this a keeper in my collection, or does it need to find itself a new home on eBay? Well, I've owned this watch for quite some time now, so please don't think this is just recency bias, but it's become my go-to when I want something 70s inspired on my wrist. It's not quite there in terms of pipping my Black Bay for a daily wear, but it's right up there in terms of wear time across my collection. I think it's quite easy to look at the F77 range and dismiss it as another in the long line of Royal Oak homages. For me though, it isn't even about the case design, it's that dial. I just love it. Outside of the NB 1060 12L, it's my favourite in my collection. But this watch is a lot more wearable and sees a lot more wear as a result. So it's definitely a keeper for me, and that poses the next question. As I mentioned at the top of the video, I have a worrying soft spot for 70s inspired sports watches, and while I cannot claim to have tried and owned them all, I am racking up decent numbers. So I wanted to discuss where the F77 ranks against its budget competition. For me right now, that's actually a very easy question to answer. I think it's right at the top. However, I think there are a number of watch models that are very close to surpassing it, and I want to go through them and talk about what they need to do to achieve that. We'll begin with what was my favourite until this point, the 12 from Christopher Ward. I've made absolutely no secret whatsoever about being a bit of a fanboy for Christopher Ward, and in truth I do think that they will reclaim their top spot title pretty quickly. They've got everything they need as part of their collections, but they don't yet exist in a single watch as far as I'm aware. What am I talking about? Well, They just released the 38mm limited edition ice cream inspired range, which is a great middle ground size that I think would suit me better than my 40mm version. The 12X also has on-the-go adjustment to its butterfly clasp. If they made a model that combines the bracelet upgrade with the 38mm sizing, I'd be trading in for an upgrade almost immediately. As it stands though, the better sizing and gradient dial of the brown smoke currently just about edges it for me. Next to discuss is the main Manhattan, which is actually an important watch in the case of my F77. Because the reason I own the brown smoke to begin with is I didn't want to compromise with the Manhattan. What do I mean by that? Well, there are two versions of this watch. 37mm, which is the size I would prefer, but also the 39mm ultra thin, which is a bit of an engineering marvel. What I'd really like is an ultra thin 37mm model, but that doesn't exist. If it did, I think it would give the F77 a serious run for its money. The Tissot PRX was a solid watch for me, but I always felt that it sat like a flying saucer on my wrist. Not necessarily giving overhang, but certainly some unsightly gaps going on beneath the lugs. One way of getting around that would be buying one on a rubber strap, which I actually think is a solid option in this case. The drawback there is that at the time of the writing, the only models being offered on rubber straps are the black and full lume quartz models, neither of which has the waffle dial reserved for the automatics. I also think it wouldn't hurt them to use an applied logo rather than printed. I do think there is a gem of the watch in there that they are yet to release. The initial launch models of the Citizen Ciosa range invited a lot of hype, but I think the truth is that the budget pricing does show in a few areas. The plain dials and print work are bright, but nothing more, and I've never been a fan of the 4 o'clock crown. I definitely think the small second variants are a huge upgrade. I've not jumped on the bandwagon with the purchase yet, because if the upgrades are this big every time, it's a surefire bet that the next variant will be another huge leap forward. Personally, I think those four are the big hitters, but I briefly want to cover some of the other competition as well. I really like the looks of the Yema Urban Traveller, but given that the movement on my Urban Flygraph isn't working properly anymore after only 3 months of ownership, and their customer service being somewhat unresponsive in resolving that issue, there's no way I could currently recommend it as realistic competition. I think the F77 is just much better looking than the Icon from Maurice Lacroix, and I've documented on the channel my negative feelings about their pricing of the Ocean plastic models. The Tesoro Aspire is good on value, but far too big and far too shiny. And beyond that, I think the logo and print work could also use a bit more refinement. While far smaller in size, I would say the same thing regarding the print work about the Herbelin Cap Camerat range. Even though it couldn't be further from the truth, something about the way that the name is printed screams Far Eastern knockoff to me. The Oleg & Waj OW8001 isn't a particularly well-known model, despite boasting a COSC-certified Soprod Newton P92 movement. I think this is largely because it's comparatively expensive against its rivals. However, I do feel that aside from its quite large crown, it is still a handsome timepiece. I think the best of the rest is the Highlight from Frédéric Constant. The downside to me there has always been the dials, which don't really rival their cheaper counterparts. They have started to get a lot more experimental recently, so I am hopeful to see something more creative from them for me to really get my teeth into soon. Now, I've tried to be comprehensive there, but if there are some budget offerings I've missed out, do let me know. I always say that I love to hear about watches that I'm not familiar with. While you might disagree with my perspective and opinion on the F77, I do hope you can appreciate the thought and comparison that's gone into this video. But having said that, if you feel differently, discuss it with me in the comments section below. As ever, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video or found it informative, consider dropping it a like and subscribing to the channel for more content like this.